teaching helps you get where you are. And today is one of those days for me. Nunziato is the William Wallace Kirkpatrick Research Professor and Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. She was my professor for both First Amendment and digital copyright, and helped shape a lot of my views there. And she's been an active contributor in the world of online freedom of expression since about when that was a thing people were talking about. And her book, Virtual Freedom, which came out when I was a law student, remains, I think, a critically important work in thinking about network neutrality and the First Amendment, and putting forth an articulation of what you would call an affirmative vision of the First Amendment that I think does a thing that very few tech books do, which is stand up after a decade of being out there in the world. And is most recently the chair of the TikTok Content Advisory Council, which I'm not sure how much you can share about this while this meeting is being recorded, but gosh, that sounds really interesting as well. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Dawn, who will be talking to us today about her article, Misinformation Mayhem, Social Media Platforms' Efforts to Combat Medical and Political Misinformation. Take it away, Professor Nunziato.
Thank you. It's just delightful to be with you all and to see my good friends, Stacy and Andy once again. Stacy and I have worked together longer ago than I care to tell you, but 25 or 30 years ago, something like that. And it was a great pleasure and privilege to have Andy as a student and now as a colleague. So thank you all for inviting me here. So I have this way too long PowerPoint presentation, and Stacy, I don't know if it's been shared with others. Can you tell me?
We haven't shared it, but I can share it with the list now or later if you like.
You can share it now, just if you would, if that's not too distracting. Okay. Just so if people want to click on a link or two, they can do that. I don't know if you can get to links while I'm doing the PowerPoint via Zoom. And I just don't want to go through, I'm not going to go through the presentation in lots and lots of detail. So just so you have that in case something piques your interest and you want to go through that in detail on your own time. I think I would like to go through a few slides and then pause for questions, but this is a slightly different crowd than I usually present to. So I'm used to, mostly law students, and this is not that crowd. So we may be taking this in a slightly different direction. So I'm open. But I've been focusing for a couple of years now on social media platforms and their interventions to attempt to correct misinformation, and their attempts to engage in and curate fact checking, which, wow, that's like really a controversial and important thing to be doing these days, I think. So let's talk a little bit about that. I look back at this quote from my colleague Jeff Rosen from 10 years ago, where he said, back in 2011, social media platforms have far more power over privacy and free speech of most citizens than any king, president, or Supreme Court justice. So maybe we shouldn't be worrying so much about who's Supreme Court justice, and focus instead on who's running the platforms. And for our purposes today, for my purposes, I would like to focus on social media platforms and the pandemic and medical misinformation and the election. So a lot of what they do applies to all sorts of misinformation, but I thought it's kind of interesting to focus on these two categories. And I guess Andy is monitoring the chat and questions and whatnot, so I'm not doing that. So what should they do, right? What should they be doing? These are policy questions, and that's what lawyers and law professors think we know something about is, you know, what they should be doing, what the platforms should be doing, if anything, in regulating misinformation. It's a huge question. And, you know, maybe some people might say they shouldn't be doing anything. You know, they should just be neutral platforms. Other people think they should be taking a much greater role than they are taking. So I want to spend some time examining what they are doing, how they're doing it, problems with what they're doing, etc. And again, this is, I think it's a hugely important and troubling and difficult question for us today and these days. And so I think, you know, if you had the unfortunate experience of watching the debate or hearing about the debate from last night, you know, you see what happened on television, and then it moves to social media, right? Then all of this moves to whatever our platforms are. And the platforms today are increasingly assuming the role of guardians, arbiters, curators of the truth, right? I mean, they're definitely doing it in the context of COVID misinformation. And to some extent, I think they've been taking on that role in the context of the elections and, you know, election information and political misinformation and disinformation. This is something that I would like to talk to you about. You know, what are the different interventions that they can take, right? They can decide what information is available. They can decide what information is subject to labeling, labeling and external fact checking, labeling and pointing to curated expert information, what information is promoted, et cetera, et cetera. And they can take sort of intermediate steps like downranking content, banning content during certain timeframes. Like you may have seen that Facebook is now prohibiting new ads in the 7 days prior to the presidential election, right? So they've got all of these possible interventions. And, you know, what advice would we give to them? Should we give to them as far as how and when and whether they should take these steps? So these are, I mean, we could stop here because these are the big issues. These are the big issues that I want to focus on. You know, what are their policies regarding COVID medical misinformation, regarding election political misinformation? And, you know, we could also further break that down into process, procedure, logistical information regarding the election, and then substantive misinformation regarding the election, like, you know, about why you should vote for Trump versus Biden, et cetera. So these categories are being treated somewhat differently. You know, so what are these policies? Should they be modified? How are they enforced? How are they enforced at scale, right? It's one thing to say, oh, we prohibit, you know, harmful misinformation regarding the pandemic. That's another thing to figure out how to do that with, you know, 40 million pieces of content. And if it's being done, you know, via algorithm, there's a whole host of other issues that I won't go into. How do you get humans to do it if they're doing it? Are the platforms doing it in a manner that's transparent and that provides notice and an opportunity to affected users? Is what we call in the First Amendment jurisprudence, is counter speech effective? And so this is kind of my doctrinal hook for a lot of this. Is it effective for the platforms to sort of hop in there and say, okay, this is bad speech. Here's, instead of censoring it, we're going to curate and provide you with some good speech. And then what guidance does the First Amendment free speech values and due process values provide? And so that's, you know, a little bit of my background is that I've been teaching First Amendment for a number of years, which is kind of increasingly not relevant for this. It's not relevant in the sense that the platforms aren't governed by the First Amendment, which you may know, because they're not state actors. So they're not state actors, so they're on their own, right? They can make whatever decisions they want about hate speech, right? First Amendment protects hate speech. Proud Boys, you want to get out there and say whatever you want, that's protected by the First Amendment by and large. Platforms, they don't have to protect that speech. So they're not governed by the First Amendment. The First Amendment may provide some guidance to what is allowed and what is not allowed by the platforms, may not. But I have just a few kind of general First Amendment principles that might guide the platforms, and I think that are guiding the platforms to some extent. You may remember that Twitter used to refer to itself as the free speech wing of the free speech party, right? Like, we are so free speech, that's us. And Facebook, I think today, maintains that it doesn't want to be the arbiter of truth, right? And it's not their role to intervene, et cetera, et cetera. So our platforms care, I think, about First Amendment principles and free speech principles generally. And one of the important primary foundational principles is that in the United States is that the proper response, the default response for bad speech is not censorship, but counter speech, is more speech. So the preferred response is not that we're going to censor your bad speech, but that we're going to talk back and engage unless there's an emergency, unless there's no time, right? And that kind of reminds me of what Facebook is doing with the 7 days before the election, cutting off new ads. So if there's time for counter speech to do its thing, then that's the default remedy. Okay, so that's one of our First Amendment principles. Another sort of aspect of our First Amendment guidance is, you know, political speech is within the core of the First Amendment's protection. That gets, by and large, the strongest protection because of the role of speech in our deliberative democracy, in our democratic processes. Not so much for speech and misinformation and lies about voting, you know, procedures and voting requirements, right? You don't really have a First Amendment right to say the election's on Wednesday this year. So maybe broader First Amendment protections for the substance of political speech and, you know, narrower protections for misinformation about the procedures and requirements related to the election, and also narrower protections for medical related speech, right? Because that's sort of more factual, that's more ideally more objective, etc. And the First Amendment and the Constitution generally has certain due process or procedural values that I think are significant for these purposes, including notice to people whose free speech rights are affected, opportunity to be heard. So sort of clear notice of what speech are you going to allow on your platform? What speech are you not going to allow on your platform? Just inform us with clear community guidelines, right? Opportunity to be heard before the speech is taken down, the content is taken down, before you're, you know, banned or deplatformed, etc. And ideally, impartial, judicial-like decision-making. So transparency, consistency in decision-making. Obviously, we know there are not judges at Facebook and Twitter making these decisions, but impartial, consistent, transparent decision-making. Those are sort of free speech due process values. this is different from what I've been talking about, but what speech do we as a body politic think should be permitted and not permitted by the social media platforms? So 85% of us in this poll said that social media companies should restrict medical disinformation. And disinformation here, I mean intentional misinformation, intentionally false. And 81% with respect to election-related disinformation. So this is a recent poll, I think February or so, of how the body politic feels about this. And you know, we are the customers. So I want to just kind of return to my big issues, my list of big issues. And I'll talk a little bit now about what, unless it's getting too boring just hearing me drone on, I'm going to just say briefly, I'm going to say a word about what the platforms are doing with respect to COVID-related misinformation. I'll just say this, that they have been aggressive in removing harmful COVID-related misinformation and in directing users to curated, authoritative, fact-checked information. And I, query whether that is a model at all, a blueprint for their actions on other types of misinformation. Because it's interesting that in the past 6 months, we've seen this major ramp up of what Twitter and Facebook and others are doing with respect, I have some numbers here somewhere, with respect to harmful COVID-related misinformation. 2 billion users on Facebook and Insta have been directed to authoritative health resources. 350 million have clicked through to those resources. A number, 95%, a large number, apparently do not proceed past a warning label to content that's been warned about. So Facebook and Facebook and Twitter have stood up to, the Trump campaign, to Trump Jr., Donald Trump Jr. posting misinformation on Facebook about COVID. I mean, that's, talk about the kings and the Supreme Court justices and whatever that my colleague Jeff Rosen was talking about. That's a lot of power. That's more power than Chris Wallace has, right? Standing up to the president and saying, we're taking down your post. We're suspending your account because of this misinformation. So this is a lot of power, and they're exercising a lot of power in this COVID context. And part of what they're doing is engaging in counter speech by pointing people to authoritative information, and also by, checking misinformation, right? This is also a form of counter speech in reminding people to wear masks, right? Taking a stand and reminding people to wear masks. Facebook's doing that. Twitter is doing the same sort of thing, right? Removing content that they determine is a threat to people's health or well-being, labeling other types of posts that they deem are not quite as harmful, like the conspiracy theories about the origin of the virus, etc. And directing people to authoritative information. So the Know the Facts page, the COVID event page, etc. So these are a lot of different technical interventions to stop this sort of information. And you've probably seen, if you've ever searched for COVID, maybe you search for a COVID test or something, you get these SOS type alerts on Google, etc., about authoritative information about coronavirus and COVID, etc. So I'll stop here for now, and given what I've discussed, You know, are the platforms doing too much? Is this a bad blueprint for platforms countering what they believe is misinformation? Are they not doing enough? You know, maybe it's good in theory, but it's not so good in practice. Are they being transparent enough about what they're doing? Are they providing users with sufficient notice and opportunity to be heard to appeal adverse decisions? One of my slides that I zipped past said that Facebook is suspending the appeals process because they're overwhelmed, right? So they're giving notice, and they're, you know, providing information about what they will and will not tolerate on their platform, but they've given up on the appeals process of like, hey, you took down this post, but I think it should stay up. So this is major control over billions and billions of users and, you know, billions of posts in the COVID context. So let me stop talking for now on medical misinformation.
Great, and we have a few comments in the chat. Let me see if I can synthesize them. If others would like to ask a question, if you could use the raise the hand feature that we're all very familiar with now, we can use that as well. A couple things coming out of the chat. You know, one observation is that, and maybe this relates to the procedural point you're making, is that, you know, some of the tools that a social network has at their disposal, downweighting things or hiding things or demonetizing things, could be done in a transparent manner, but could be done totally silently as well. Do you think it's important that a social network, inform the public of the actions it's taking in those sorts of situations?
So I think it's important for them to inform people about what their policies are. I guess it's a little counterintuitive if they're going to demote something to announce the demotion, because that sort of runs counter to not drawing attention to those posts. But I think it's important for them to tell the content provider, the user, that you violated this restriction and therefore we are suspending you, demoting you, removing the post, etc. I actually think that's really crucial as a matter of due process type concerns for the platforms to do that. That's a drum that I've been beating for like 10 years or so now.
Great. And then another question coming out of the chat.
And wait, Andy, can I just say that?
Oh yeah, of course.
I mean, as an implementation matter, and as a matter of the algorithms, I think that may be difficult to do, right? It may be difficult for them to provide that sort of a notice, certainly to provide an opportunity to be heard and to challenge. That's difficult. And who's gonna be the decider on those questions for the 2 billion pieces of content?
Right, the scale problems, which I know folks like Kate Klonick and Evelyn Dweck and others have already published some about as well. Another question that's coming out, and I'm borrowing a little bit from what Ari wrote in the chat, and also something I was thinking about, is that I wonder, when we're talking about the medical context in particular, if there's a middle ground between a fact and an idea. So a lot of the defense of the substance of that you put towards the back of the paper about defending sort of why it's okay for the platforms to be regulating content in this way, even assuming they were subject to First Amendment scrutiny, which of course they're not under the state action doctrine. You can defend a lot of what they're doing because intentionally false statements of fact, and even some non-intentionally false statements of facts, often are not protected under the First Amendment, except in certain cases like Alvarez and things like that. Whereas ideas is really where we have the marketplace of ideas, and we tend to be much more counter-speech oriented and more robust. When it comes to like health policies, like social distance, wear your mask, it almost feels like we're somewhere between those two things. They're not the inject bleach into your vein because that's going to cure the coronavirus, or that's like not true. But we're also sort of taking a complex factual environment and coming up with recommendations about how we should behave, which almost feels more policy oriented. And I don't know, reading the Twitter guidelines that you put into one of the footnotes, it seemed like actually saying like, don't socially distance, or, you know, social distancing is not effective or whatever it might be,
Yeah, that's
would be flaggable under the Twitter policy. I
right,
wonder if
right.
that holds up as well.
So, right. And so the, you know, the, I don't know how to say it in a neutral manner, but the sort of COVID non-believers would say, you know, that's my opinion and opinions are protected, right? My opinion is that social distancing is ineffective. And yet Twitter is, and therefore Twitter is biased against my opinion when they don't allow that post. That's a huge amount of power, right? For the platforms to be exercising. You know, I don't have answers. I have questions for us. I really don't. I mean, you know, I tend to think, I guess, that what the platforms have been doing has been pretty careful and pretty well guided by the people that I respect and the institutions that I respect as expert institutions. And I do, you know, to go back to the Moynihan quote, you know, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And yet this line between facts and opinion on some of these matters is contested.
Great, I see Ari has his hand up.
Yeah, I think it's more complicated than this. I think especially when it deals with science, facts are very elusive concepts. For example, I'll give you a concrete example. In March, Fauci gave an interview with 60 Minutes where he completely downplayed masks and said that it was not necessary for people to wear masks. At the time, the WHO was not recommending people wear masks. So you can imagine a medical opinion that said we should be wearing masks would have been censored at the time if these policies were in effect then. The problem is that, especially in these emergency times, we are seeing science being done in real time. It's not that we have 5-10 years to kind of figure out what the science is. And these big companies have the ability to actually shape the direction in which the science goes. And that could be dangerous. I mean, physically dangerous in terms of leading us down the wrong path.
So, you know, if you're advising the platforms, would, you know, based on that comment, what would the advice be? You know, would it be don't intervene and let 1,000 flowers bloom as far as COVID expertise and advice and information? I mean, I think that there's some merit to that approach, but there are also some challenges with that approach.
I think on anything that is policy related, as Andy said, you know, this is the wisdom behind the First Amendment. It's not that everyone has intelligent ideas or even good ideas, but when it comes to policy and especially also science, it's not always clear what the good ideas. It takes sometimes 10-15 years for us to figure out what the good ideas were. And science has gotten it very wrong historically. You know, we've bet the horse on things that were very destructive in the past, and we clear it up, we sort it up over time. But if you nip it early on in the emerging side, and all this research on masks is emerging. No one was researching masks 6 months ago. It's 6 months of research. You know, there's a lot of research on this. We can't do randomized controlled trials because we can't tell people not to wear masks and see if they get infected. It's all emerging science, and for anyone, even for a scientific body, to curtail discussion, I think is a bad idea. Now, yes, you have this problem that crazy people spout all kinds of nonsense, and the average person can't differentiate between, you know, scientific opinion and nonsense. But this has to be done very, very carefully. And LinkedIn has done this wrong. I posted in the chat an example of a person I know personally who was banned for a week until Michael Levitt got involved and got him reinstated.
Can you just describe those facts for us, or for what happened on LinkedIn, or did you put it in the chat?
Well, I mean, this is someone who was posting research articles from the fringes of the legitimate research. So he was not making up nonsense theories. He was simply highlighting papers that he found interesting from Boston Medical Journal, JAMA, New England Medicine, whatever. But these were papers that had not received much attention. And he was highlighting them, and some of them contravened existing positions. And at some point, he was taken off. For him, this was a major blow because his entire employment, he's a self-employed person, was based on this, on LinkedIn. He did all his B2B work on this. So it wasn't just that they were silencing his voice, they were cutting off his income. And not everyone can have a Nobel Prize winner come to your rescue and get you reinstated.
Yeah, well, I guess the upshot of these comments is that the platforms should not be taking any role in being the arbiters of truth about COVID-related misinformation, that they should let speech and counter speech and the marketplace of ideas, opinions, facts, whatever, have it out on the platforms. And that's, that is certainly, that's more where we found ourselves, a few years ago, I would say, before all of this active role of the platforms in labeling and taking down content, right? And engaging in this sort of active, counter speech and curation of speech. So that's certainly something that they had pursued in the past. And, a lot of people, Ari, obviously are talking about this in connection with the Communications Decency Act, CDA 230, and the immunity that the platforms enjoy, right? The idea was that, hey, the platforms enjoy this immunity to the extent that they are, sort of neutral platforms. But if they're taking a role in, on one side of a debate or another, then they shouldn't continue to enjoy this immunity. And that's certainly an argument that we have heard recently. So, Andy, before I move on, any other comments that you want to raise?
Let me quickly, so Ron, you had a comment, I don't know if you can maybe expound on this a little bit about, can we even trust these platforms to do the right thing in light of their financial model? And since Ron unmuted, I'm going to turn it over to him to explain this question.
No, yeah. So thank you. Yeah, hopefully I can speak now without noise background. So I think it just prima facie, even without going any further, I think the platforms are incapable of making any decisions like that in socially charged or any matters or any charged matter, since they are so heavily involved financially in the network, right? Any reasonable basis for decision making, judicial system arbitration, says that. So that it has to be, if we go anywhere, it has to be something which is financially independent from the platform themselves. So how to do it? Some body which is how to get a body which represents the people. So we have the state, right? But the state is definitely not apt or nimble enough to deal there. And also, there are all these restrictions on the state from the First Amendment that maybe we don't want to carry over. Maybe Ari would want to carry over, but since this is a brave new world altogether, so maybe we want to do something else. Also, it's not just the U.S. There's the entire world there. So we have to somehow think how to structure those things. I think Facebook actually tried to do such a thing at some point. I don't know where it's going, but that would be something that we can start talking about. But that's kind of step one.
So one consideration is what Facebook is doing with its oversight board. And Ron, maybe you're familiar with that. Is that how you pronounce your name, Ron?
Yes, yes, yeah.
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 Facebook over the past year and a half has been working toward constituting this Facebook oversight board. People refer to it as, the Facebook Supreme Court. It's and maybe Andy knows something about this as well. It's an independent body that is separately structured and financially independent from Facebook, and is I don't remember all who's on it, but folks from different countries, folks from different disciplines, and they are responsible for making some ultimate decisions about what content, at least, and I think some other procedures as well, are followed by Facebook. So maybe that's something to aspire to, depending on how things shake out with the Facebook oversight board. Andy, do you do any work in that area, if I may ask?
No, I haven't. I know that this very question was raised of the oversight board when it was first constituted, like, will they actually take an action that will be against the monetary interests of Facebook or not? I think there's been more critique of the oversight board, in part just because they haven't stood up yet. I mean, they're just not up and running yet, and so the other concern is like, well, what are they waiting for? I think is the other concern that I've heard from them as well. But I have no personal experience with them.
Yeah. So having an external body, perhaps, that's not beholden to the financial interests of the platforms themselves would be significant, and perhaps one that is more representative of the body politic. But then, then we are sort of heading in the direction of the government. So listen, these were the easy questions. The easy questions were the ones having to do with COVID. The harder questions and harder issues, I think, are the ones having to do with the political falsehoods and political misinformation. Andy, should I move on to talk about that, or are there other questions on this subset?
I think we've covered the questions that were in the chat. Of course, if folks have other questions, they can always use the raise the hand feature.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just throw this in there. This is another issue that I've been interested in of late. I've been working with some of my colleagues at GW at this Institute of Data, Democracy, and Politics, which was recently stood up a year or so ago. So I've been working with some data scientists, and there are physics professors and professors of other disciplines, computer science, et cetera, that are part of this Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. Again, I'm not a data scientist, but I'm really interested in some of the work that they are doing, including my colleague, Ethan Porter, who has done some work in the area of the effectiveness of fact-checking in preventing the spread of misinformation. So according to some of the research that he has done, fact-checking can be effective. And the things that are significant about effective fact checks include that the fact checks come from credible sources, that they frame the issue in a new way as opposed to merely labeling a post as misinformation. And they adhere to these other requirements as well. So a lot of work is being done in the area of examining the effectiveness of fact-checking. And you all probably know a lot more about this and can analyze these studies a lot better than I can. But I think this is very promising and very interesting if you assume that if we can assume that there are such things as misinformation that that warrant fact-checking and correction. And that's actually a fair bit of what I want to talk about in connection with what Facebook is doing and is not doing. So, but I'll sort of throw this out there for us to be thinking about. And now to talk a little bit about political misinformation. And There's a lot I want to talk about, and we don't have all that much time, so I'll try to go quickly. What are they doing? What are the platforms doing with regard to false and misleading political ads? Google says that it is removing demonstrably misleading political ads. Twitter is completely banning political ads, and we'll see how they define political since for about a year now. Facebook subjects public posts to external fact checking so long as the public posts aren't direct speech by government or elected officials. Okay, that's one thing they're doing. Another thing that Facebook is doing that I mentioned earlier is now they are prohibiting new political ads in 7 days leading up to our presidential election. And some other countries have a media blackout period leading up to elections, and Facebook has just, I think it was within a few weeks, adopted this policy. And that I guess Ari and I were talking about the role of counter speech. I guess one of the justifications for this is that they think that there's not enough time for counter speech to do its job in 7 days prior to the election. That might seem like a lot of time, but so no new political ads. And all of them have policies banning certain deep fakes, harmful deep fakes as they define them as harmful. Okay, so this is an overview of what they're doing, and they're also doing other things with respect to election polling information related misinformation, right? Like the election's on a Wednesday, not on a Tuesday this year. So let's talk about some of this. Twitter ban on political ads, not political content, but promoted political ads. And Jack Dorsey says, this is not about restricting free expression. This is about restricting paying for reach. And we're just not up for this task right now of allowing for political ads. The infrastructure, today's democratic infrastructure is not prepared to handle this. See 2016, okay? I'm not gonna go into those details. Facebook, as I mentioned, announced this relatively new policy. That's number one that they're doing. Number two, as I said, they subject, you can flag, or their AI, their algorithms can flag public posts for fact checking, except if they're posts by politicians. And they have recently announced that they are going to remove false information that is misrepresentation about the logistics of voting, okay? So let's talk a little bit about fact checking. So direct speech by politicians is not subject to fact checking on Facebook, but all other public posts, including other political ads, are subject to Facebook's fact checking process. Now, depending how you feel about fact checking, you may think that this is a good thing or a bad thing, that some public posts are subject to fact checking, but not public officials' posts. And this is some of what Facebook said about this, like, hey, free expression, we care about free speech. It's not our role. It's not our role, especially because political speech is the most scrutinized speech that there is. And I question, if we have time to talk about micro-targeting of political ads, whether that is the case, right? If political ads can be micro-targeted to sort of 7 people or 100 people, then they're not the most political speech that there is. They're just examined by those handful of people, right? So Facebook doesn't allow for the fact-checking of direct speech by politicians because they say we believe in free expression so much, yet they don't really, because they restrict all types of speech, right? Like, and this ad here in which the president said certain things about Joe Biden and Ukraine. Joe Biden asked for Facebook to subject that to fact checking. They didn't do it, but they did ban it because Biden was heard using profanity. Okay, so they say that they can't do this because they love free speech so much, but yet they do pick and choose when to protect free speech, right? They regulate all kinds of speech, as we see here. An earlier article I wrote called Misinformation Online or something, had like a 15-page appendix of Facebook's community guidelines and what speech they restrict. So they restrict all kinds of speech. So why not subject this speech to fact checking if they're going to subject other speech to fact checking, right? So let's talk about the fact checking. We can hold off on that question, but talk a little bit about the fact checking that Facebook curates. Okay. So any public post on Facebook can be flagged by users or by their algorithms or by journalists, etc., for fact checking. Including now videos, photos, etc., can be tagged for fact checking. And then once it's flagged, third-party independent fact checkers review and evaluate these posts. The fact checkers are certified by this international fact-checking network. And among the ones that have been certified, Facebook chooses which ones it wants as its fact checkers. And these are the ones in the United States. They may have other fact checkers that they're working with also on the COVID-related misinformation. And the fact checkers get to issue these ratings for posts, including false and false headline. Okay. And then this is what happens if the fact checkers rate the speech as false. Including, the fact checkers may be commissioned to write related articles. So they don't call it like, yours is false and this is true. They used to do something like that, but it didn't go over that well with the people who were subject to the fact checking. So instead what they do is they make available, they commission from fact checkers related articles, and then they put that up next to the speech that's been fact checked. So the related article is posted alongside the post that's deemed to be false, okay? And they're posting these prominent fact checking labels on various posts. Let me see if, so I think I'll stop there for now to see if we have comments and questions on what Facebook is doing with respect to this fact checking.
Yeah, I see Sarah's hand up.
Yeah, hi, sorry. I know you didn't want to spend that much time on this, but I was curious about this harmful deepfake thing. And how they define what's a harmful deepfake.
Yeah, so I mean, and the issue of what they define as harmful generally, like harmful COVID-related posts versus, so harmful COVID-related misinformation versus not so harmful COVID-related misinformation. Those are really difficult and squishy policy decisions for them to make. And I think actually, if we click on, I probably shouldn't do it because I don't know what's going to happen if I do it, but if we click on this, we can see what exactly they specify as likely to cause harm. I don't know if there's more information there, but likely to lead to sort of real world harm or harmful beliefs. So if you all want to sort of pull that up and talk about that a little bit. I know that Professor Citron has written about deepfakes, and so she is an expert on issues of deepfakes and restrictions of deepfakes. I mean, one thing, this is not to your question, Sarah, but one thing that I think is kind of interesting is that the platforms are not restricting shallow fakes, even though shallow fakes may be, you know, as harmful and easier to, certainly easier to produce than deep fakes. By and large, they're not restricting shallow fakes. Anything that comes up here, and again, I'm afraid I will sort of throw myself out of this Zoom if I click on this. So.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at it now, and it looks like the three things that they're asking are: is the content deceptively altered or fabricated, significantly deceptively altered or fabricated? 2, is the content shared in a deceptive manner? And 3, is it likely to impact public safety or cause serious harm? So
public safety.
That was helpful. That link was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, I had a question just about what is the term shallow fake refer to? Just general fake information, or is there something a little more specific?
It's more specific than that, and the computer scientists on the conference can answer better than
Adam is a computer scientist.
So I was guessing.
I know what the phrase deepfake refers to.
I was thinking it was just like Photoshop, but not machine learning video deepfake. That was my assumption. I don't know though.
I think that's my understanding as well. But that's another, lots of difficult lines to draw. But I think shallow fake is not using AI.
Yeah, I think Joan Donovan has a really nice paper that sort of like taxonomizes these different forms of manipulation, where she talks about deep fakes, where there's actually using AI to try and actually deceive you. Cheap fakes, which, like, if you thought about it, you're definitely not deceived, which I think is sort of doing the same function as shallow fakes. So like obviously manipulated media, which still can be actually quite corrosive as well. I have Stacy and then Jocelyn.
Oh, and can I just also say before Stacy that the Pelosi video was a shallow fake, not a deep fake. So that if they were banning only deep fakes, the Pelosi video wouldn't, the one where she was slowed down to make it appear that she was drunk or on drugs. My understanding is that that was a shallow fake, not a deep fake. And so that would not be subject to bans on harmful deep fakes.
That's interesting, because I would have thought it had something to do with whether it was deceptive, right? So, but it's clearly not, right? It's about it's about the use of AI. So in her case, it was really just slowing it down, but it was clearly deceptive, right? So, so yeah, your point is a good one, that maybe the line is being, or your suggestion, maybe the line is being drawn in a place that doesn't necessarily get at the harm that we're looking to address. But my question was about Facebook and its fact checking. What triggers that whole process? Is it a complaint to Facebook, or is it,
So it can be triggered by users themselves. Like if I'm going through my feed, I might see something, a public post that I think is misinformation, and so I could flag it. Of the many reasons you can flag something on Facebook, because it's nudity, or because it's self-harm, etc. You can flag something as false or misleading. And then once it's been flagged, and again, this is not something that most of us casual Facebook users do. Once it's been flagged, then it can be referred to a fact checker. One of these external fact checkers.
Yeah, so it ties into some of the concerns we've talked about these kind of insular communities, because, as you point out, if something is going to a community of true believers who already are inclined in this direction, and whose views are likely to be further reinforced by the falsity, it's not likely to be flagged, right?
Right. So users can flag posts as false, but also journalists can, and also Facebook's machine learning can. And apparently these days, most of the posts get flagged by Facebook's machine learning algorithms for potential, falseness. So those are the various ways in which they get flagged, and then they get referred out. And I think in Facebook's transparency reporting, we may have information about how much content was acted upon in this manner, which is pretty interesting, I think. So let me pop forward. And I would also be interested to see how, Facebook has gotten a lot of criticism for not fact-checking politicians' political ads. But there's everyone else's political ads and political content, rather, that is still subject to fact-checking. So I think it'll be interesting to see what Facebook has done by way of, how much content is referred to these fact checkers, what do they do with it? And then to Stacy's point, does it make any difference in, does counter speech actually work for sort of filter bubbles and echo chambers, et cetera, right? And that's part of what some of my colleagues are working on. How can fact-checking be done in a more effective manner and not a manner where people just say like, oh, I'm not looking at that because they labeled my stuff as, as false. I think that's really interesting. I've also been thinking a little bit about this in the context of defamation, because, somebody who says Joe Biden is a pedophile, I had that on one of my earlier slides, might be able to defend themselves by saying that statement wasn't made with knowing or reckless disregard for the truth, because everything that I read says he is a pedophile. But if, and to the extent that there is counter speech going on and Facebook says like, here are the facts, here's what our independent fact checkers came up with, here's what AP says about this QAnon, this element of the QAnon conspiracy theory. I think that sort of cuts against the would-be defamer's defense. And I was thinking about this also in the context of the defamation actions against Alex Jones in the Sandy, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but for defaming the Sandy Hook parents. So Alex Jones and InfoWars, said Sandy Hook never happened. The massacre of children at Sandy Hook never happened. This was a synthetic, et cetera, and got sued for defamation by some of the parents of the children who were actually killed. And so far, the last I checked, the of Alex Jones and opinion, not fact. This is political hyperbole, not an assertion of fact. This was not made with reckless disregard for the truth. Those defenses have not been successful. And I think that the more accurate speech, if you believe that there's such a thing as accurate speech, the more that accurate speech is sort of pointed to by the platforms, right? Here's some related articles on this. Sandy Hook actually happened. 23 children were killed, or whatever the number was, and this actually happened. So your echo chamber filter bubble can't protect you, if you know what I'm saying.
This is really interesting. It reminds me a little bit of the defamation case, the Hart-Hanks case, where the Supreme Court looked at a case where a journalist had a recording of an interview and then didn't listen to it, and that could be potentially found to be reckless disregard for the truth. It's almost like the proverbial cassette player is on the desk here, to use like a 1980s metaphor. I think I saw Jocelyn's hand up next. Jocelyn Hannibarian, who's the Assistant Director of the Technology Law Clinic. Didn't get a chance to introduce yourself earlier.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I had to join a little later, so I'm thrilled to be here. I was just going to ask, this is related to Professor Dogan's question, and you did address this in part already, but is there any attention paid or weight paid to the identity of the speaker when in the fact-checking process in terms of their reach? Like how many, is there a prioritization by how many followers they have, how big a microphone they have, or even what kind of a speaker they are? And you mentioned politicians, so I was curious.
I don't know. That's a great question. And that may be, in what I've read about Facebook's fact checking, I haven't come across any reference to that, but I guess I would be surprised if they didn't somehow prioritize that, right? They say that they allow for fact checking of public posts, but if I have, 20 friends on Facebook, which I don't have, I don't do it a lot. So I probably have like 20 friends, and I post something that's public, I don't think they're going to spend that much time and energy fact checking some false thing that I may have said, right? I think to your question, it would be a lot more efficient for them to spend time fact checking, someone who has a lot more influence and a lot more friends, or on, Twitter, a lot more followers. So I don't know what's inside the box, the black box. And I don't know if that information is out there, but I think that's something that they probably do focus on and should focus on, because they can't do it all. And I just think that this work that these fact checkers are doing is very, noteworthy. And, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's pretty interesting that Facebook, the platform, is responsible for this huge program of getting potentially false information countered by these members of this, international fact-checking network.
Yeah, I know this is a big question, so table it if it's not, great to answer here, but does this get them into publisher territory rather than platform territory? The more you interface with user-generated content?
I mean, I think, we think about this in the context of CDA 230 and whether they are co-creators in some sense of the content, right? I mean, if they are in there, and or even in the context of the, say COVID information, here's what we consider to be the authoritative information. Here it is. Are they responsible in whole or in part for that content? To ask the sort of CDA 230 question looks more and more, I mean, I know that, CDA is sort of Teflon for the platforms, but more and more, I think it looks like they are, to your question, playing a greater and greater role in the curation of this content and this, counter speech.
And it's not just that particular content, right? It's, they can lose their protection altogether if they start curating generally. So that's, that's what makes it really interesting. The stuff they decide to leave up and put this alongside, they could face liability for leaving that up if they are seen to be publishers in that way. That's a really interesting question.
I agree very much. But the question is, would this institution of this independent board and getting the decisions outside the hands of the company, would that help here? Now the company is back to being kind of a technical channel, right? Maybe it funds the board because of the offshoot of the, whatever the ads, but the funds are just to keep it running, not to, decide in any way.
Right. So there's the Facebook Oversight Board, but then there are also these entities that are working with Facebook to produce for them the counter speech, the related articles. And I don't know what the financial arrangements look like, and I don't know the extent to which, the 230 inquiry focuses on that, but Jocelyn, those are really great questions for the 230 inquiry and others as well. Andy, any more on?
Yes. So I have Daniel Cohen asked in the chat. Is there any thought about this publisher question coming up in the context of the feed that is generated by Facebook? You know, could there be a cause of action or something related to the feed itself? And then Ari also wanted to note that there's a little bit of a push in both directions here. Some political interests want them to curate more, and others want them to curate less. And both sides are threatening a 230 overhaul.
They can't win for losing. Poor Facebook. So as far as the feed, what exactly are we talking about here? Are we talking about someone's news feed?
Yeah, I don't know if Daniel wants to talk more about it, but you know, thinking about it, I guess maybe from 230 as it exists today, or maybe just more generally, you know, what sort of responsibility would feel appropriate to put on Facebook when it comes to the algorithm by which it identifies and promotes stories, which obviously, if we attach liability, I think would give Facebook a pretty strong incentive to avoid political misinformation or bad political or medical speech. I'll put aside sort of how you define bad for a second here.
Yeah, and also to sort of tie that back into, I think to tie it back into Jocelyn's question, you know, if Facebook or Twitter, to the extent that they are saying, you know, we're going to promote this accurate information about the election, about Joe Biden, about the COVID, to what extent is that, you know, their content and their speech? I think, and including, you know, what is made available and promoted in the feed. Those are really good questions. And as I said at the beginning, I have questions for you, not answers, unfortunately. So really, you know, big issues for us to think about, including to think about in terms of advising the platforms, right? What to do, and to think about the ramifications of the advice that, you know, is given to them. Because I think more and more, you know, students of the law, students of technology are going to be put in the position of giving, you know, being asked to give advice to the platforms on these questions. I would like to talk a little bit about micro-targeting if we have a chance. So let me see if I can pop, over to micro-targeting. So you know what, I think you have a sense of what it is, and I want to talk about Cambridge Analytica, but also talk about the extent to which the platforms have been asked to restrict micro-targeting of political ads, and to some extent have done so, right? So they've got all of this, Facebook especially has vast caches of information and data about us that they have collected over the years. And through the micro-targeting of political ads, a politician can target an ad's distribution to a highly particularized audience, right? Based on information that Facebook and others have collected about us. Thank you, Facebook. If you haven't done this already, and you probably have a sense of it, you know, look at the Facebook offline activity to get a sense of all of what Facebook has known and knows about you, and can then sell to politicians who want to micro-target an ad to you, right? What was that movie called? The Great Hack, I think it was called. The Great Hoax or The Great Hack, a really interesting treatment of Cambridge Analytica, which micro-targeted political ads for the Cruz campaign and the Trump campaign, and said that they had 5,000 data points on every US voter. based on Facebook data on 87 million people. And with that sort of data, if that's accurate and true, they could carefully micro-target an ad, maybe an ad for clothing, or an ad for a politician in favor of one politician or another. So this is some of what happened in the past, and I referenced this earlier by saying that with the micro-targeting of political ads, broad public scrutiny and consideration and assessment of that speech is not possible, right? And that's back to Stacy's question about, the sort of filter bubbles and how can we effectively rely on counter speech to do its job. So I think it's interesting, especially now, for us to think about the ways in which the micro-targeting of political ads thwarts these First Amendment values and these default First Amendment remedies of counter speech. So what are the platforms doing and what aren't they doing? Facebook's not doing much of anything. Google is doing a fair amount. Google is actually now greatly restricting the micro-targeting of political ads on its platforms. Twitter, as we've talked about, prohibits all political ads on its platform, so micro-targeted or otherwise. And Facebook is mostly continuing this hands-off approach of continuing to allow micro-targeting of political ads, despite its role in majorly facilitating micro-targeting in the 2016 election. They were touting the fact that they are allowing some user controls of this, if you can figure out, how to do that. And they've said, oh, we want to put this in the user's hands to control the ads that they receive, et cetera. But as a top-down matter, they're not doing anything. Google is, and Google, as of January, is restricting the micro-targeting of political ads. So all of Google's powerful, sophisticated user targeting tools cannot be used for political ads. They can political advertisers can target ads based on age, gender, zip code, and then contextual targeting, and that's all. So Google has taken some major steps in this area. Facebook has not. Well, what are they making available? All of the platforms now have ad libraries. So they're keeping track of all of the political ads that are purchased and made available on their platforms. And they're requiring, I think, pretty rigorous proof that the ads are purchased by US entities. Again, trying to solve the 2016 problem. And you can take a look at all of the ads that are in Google or Facebook's ad libraries. And I just pulled up one from a few months ago to give us a sense of the micro-targeting issue. So here's an ad placed by Inner Americans. It's an anti-Pelosi ad that cost a very small amount of money, under $100, and that was targeted to males who are between 55 and 64 years old. Okay, so that's a lot of what happened with the very finely honed micro-targeting of political ads in 2016. And, as far as I know, this is still permitted on Facebook and is still going forward on Facebook. And, I've already mentioned this, but this is a problem for the role of counter speech, right? So the ads are there in the library. So that's good. Transparency is a good thing, but who's looking? Who's scrutinizing the ads in the ad libraries? And can these ads be responded to and countered effectively? Before, we don't have that much time left, but before I move on to the final topic, any comments or questions about restrictions on micro-targeting and the role of micro-targeting of political ads?
We have Aloni with a question.
Yeah, hi. Hi.
Hi.
So there's two different ways that ads, or many ways, but like, let's say 2 different ways that ads get shown to different groups of people, right? One is that an advertiser says, I only want to show this ad to men. And another is that the ad platform algorithms, the ad serving algorithms, decides that the ads are more relevant to men. And decides by looking at the content or looking at the words or looking at the pictures that men want to see the ad more than women, or that it will get more traction with men than women, and therefore shows the ad to men, even if the advertiser never selected the attribute as a targeting attribute. So 2 things. One is, when Google says that they're turning off the micro-targeting, it sounds like they're turning off the advertiser's ability to choose who the ad goes to, except for a few these features.
Right.
But so the question I have on that is, do they also turn off this affinity, part of the algorithm, or interest part of the algorithm, that also does characteristic based targeting on many more attributes than this? That's question 1. And question 2 is, if you go to the next slide with the bar charts.
Yeah, let me just respond to your first question.
Sure.
I think the answer is yes. I think that Google also prohibits the algorithms from doing that targeting, but I'm not.
So Google has engineered, I just trying to imagine how they would have to do that. There has to be a feature somewhere that says don't use anything, but even internally, don't use anything but these features. And I guess that seems like an engineering lift that they might not have ever had to build before this. It's not just a matter of turn off this option.
Yeah. So I'm not positive, but I think that the answer is yes, that they have done that lift.
I see. Okay. And I was just going to say on the bar chart that when I look at that, I look at that age spread, I imagine that that seems to me maybe Facebook is deciding that this is the most relevant audience, and not necessarily that the advertisers selected those age ranges. Because my understanding is that if you selected, for example, whatever that is, 55 to 64, that it would not show the ad to other ages. So I don't know. That was just some food.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Right.
Yes.
So the fact that there's a spread, I think maybe suggests either that they had multiple campaigns, so you can have the same creative with many campaigns, or that they had one campaign and the algorithm sort of figured out that this age group was the most engaged by this ad, and so kept showing it to that group.
Those are really great follow-up questions, and I'm not positive about the answer to them, but yeah, I see what you mean, that this is, so these seem to be more about the choices that the algorithms are making than that the actual people who are placing the ads.
Or they targeted 50-year-olds to 70-year-olds, which sort of would also explain a spread.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you, Alon. Andy, any other comments on that?
No other comments right now. I guess we have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
One thing that came up in the discussion that I saw Ron and Stacy and others were talking about is sort of what might the role be about public education, about misinformation and things like that. I think this is a question that comes up very often here about couldn't we do something? Could we attack this in a more systemic way and better educate folks in those areas? Stacy had a couple comments about potential shortcomings in that. Obviously, there's cognitive bias concerns and behavioral economics sort of casting doubts on our ability to do some of these things as well. And I think Adam just made a point as well.
And the platforms have also put a lot of money into the sort of media education and media literacy projects. And I haven't provided that information. I think it's discussed perhaps in the article, the extent to which they're pouring a lot of money into resources for media literacy. And then in the other article that I wrote in Notre Dame, I sort of talked about that as well. And I apologize that I just can't read the chat and speak intelligently at the same time. I tried it with my students, and I'm just like, whoa, I can do one or the other. I can't.
I do too. That's what Andy's here for.
Okay.
I'm the voice of the chat. That's my job now.
So I said earlier, and I know we don't have too much time, but I said earlier that political misinformation might be broken down into misinformation about the substantive issues versus misinformation about election procedures. And with respect to the latter, I think that all the platforms are taking, recently have been taking pretty stringent steps to restrict and punish purveyors of intentional misinformation, disinformation about election procedures. So I've given you all of their policies, Google, YouTube policies for examples of this type of election-related misinformation, Twitter's policies regarding the same, and Facebook, from what I've seen, is doing warning labels and pop-ups, but not removing content related to election-related procedures. And another issue, which will have to be our last, is what to do about candidates declaring victory, or people saying, promoting candidates declaring victory before the results are in, right? What should the platforms do about that? If you were advising the platforms, what should they do about speech that falls into that category? So major issues that the platforms are confronting in these final weeks leading up to the election, right? Because they've got, just to sort of recap, they've got COVID to deal with, and all of the billions of pieces of COVID related information, misinformation. They have political ads and political speech that are being flagged for being false, and referring those out to their fact checkers. And then they have this information, which hopefully the machine learning can do a very good job, I would think, of rounding up for them, so that they can, to use the technical term, identifying for them so that they can subject it to their interventions, right? I think that this, to some extent, this is clearly objective information that's not subject to sort of opinions, right? It's not, we can't really protect the opinion of whether you can you can vote by text. There are obviously opinions regarding voter fraud and issues relating to mail-in ballots. And so those are more nuanced discussions and considerations that the platforms are having. So the job for them is to sort of identify a category of misinformation regarding election procedures that they can sort of jump in and take meaningful interventions regarding. Comments and questions on this last bit? God help us. That's my comment.
It's daunting.
Yeah. But the platforms have just been, innovating a tremendous amount, for better or for worse, depending on your perspective. They've been very, very involved in these interventions over the past 6 months, both COVID and election-related interventions. I think that's basically all I have.
Great. and we are at time. But thank you very much, Professor Nunziato, for joining us. It's so great to see you. And thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you all. It was really exciting to talk to you about these issues.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Dawn.
Thank you. Very appreciated.
Dawn, I'm gonna copy the chat and send it to you just so you can see.
Oh.
I think Andy
So I
drew
can finally read it.
everything, but there were some links too. So
Excellent. Thank you. That's great. So before we end, yeah.
all right, thank you so much. We'll have you for dinner one of these days.
God willing, that would be great. Take care, everybody.
Good to see you.